They were taught not to live, but to die. 17-year-olds Masha and Nadya were thrown into the very hell of war, deep behind enemy lines. They were meant to become shadows, ghosts. But when they were captured, they became a symbol of unbreakable spirit. What did the Nazis do to two Russian girls when they discovered they were spies? This documentary, based on unique eyewitness accounts, reveals the story of the last, most terrible hours of their lives. It's about brutal torture, inhuman courage, and the words they spoke before their execution, words that still send shivers down the spine today. This is a story of heroism that they tried to erase from memory, but it proved to be stronger than time. The Great Patriotic War was not just the roar of tank armies and the thunder of attack planes. It had another, quiet, almost invisible face, that of a young girl in a faded tunic with a radio on her back and a deadly ampule sewn into her collar. This was the war of female spies, those night witches of the secret front, whose heroism was as great as it was unknown, and whose lives were as short as a flash in the night sky. The story of two of them, Maria Sinelnikova and Nadezhda Pronina, became one of the most poignant and terrifying testaments to what the human soul is capable of when faced with absolute evil. They were nearly the same age, but as different as two poles. Masha Sinelnikova, a Jewish girl from the Belarusian town of Cherikov, was fire. 17 years old, with magnificent braids, energetic and assertive, she had been a parachute enthusiast since childhood, was an excellent shot, and, most valuably, was fluent in German, having studied at the Moscow Institute of Foreign Languages before the war. When the war took first her father and then her older brother, a paratrooper, she didn't hesitate. She relentlessly petitioned the Podolsk City Committee of the Komsomol, demanding to be sent to the front. Her fierce determination and knowledge of the language impressed a representative from the intelligence department of the 43rd Army, and Masha was accepted into a special school for radio operators and intelligence agents. Nadya Pronina, a girl from a village near Kursk, was her complete opposite: quiet, serious, and somewhat reserved. She was a year older than Masha, but seemed more mature and wise. Due to her parents' illness, she had to give up her dreams of college and go to work at the Podolsk mechanical plant. But her ideological commitment and reliability did not go unnoticed. Even before the war began, she, as one of the most trusted members of the Komsomol, was invited to train at the intelligence school. They met there, in the intelligence department of the 43rd Army, during the most terrible time, the autumn of 1941, when the enemy was at the gates of Moscow. At this point, where fear and hope mixed into a deadly cocktail, these two dissimilar girls, the city intellectual and the village worker, became more than just partners. They became sisters. They were bound by that unique frontline friendship, stronger than any blood ties, a friendship born on the threshold of death and sealed by a shared understanding that tomorrow might never come for them. They were too young for war, for death, for the horror they were about to plunge into. They should have been falling in love, going to dances, dreaming of the future. But instead, they learned to kill silently, to parachute into the black, frozen forest, and to remain silent under torture, to remain silent in the face of death. And this friendship, this quiet, unseen support, became their last and only stronghold in the hell they had willingly stepped into, never to return. The intelligence schools of the Great Patriotic War were nothing like ordinary educational institutions. They were ruthless, accelerated assembly lines for producing living weapons, factories that, in a matter of weeks or, at best, months, molded yesterday's schoolgirls and students into soldiers of the invisible front. Masha Sinelnikova and Nadya Pronina, like hundreds of other girls, were thrown into the grinding gears of this merciless system whose primary goal was not to teach them how to live, but how to die correctly. There were no beautiful uniforms, no romantic mystique that surrounds the image of a spy in the movies. There was only hunger, cold, grueling training, and the constant awareness that their lives were to be short, bright flashes, doomed to be quickly extinguished. The training program was brutally intense. In just a few weeks, they had to master what would take years in peacetime. They learned to shoot all types of weapons, from pistols to machine guns, to throw grenades, and to handle explosives. They were forced on multi-kilometer forced marches through forests and swamps in all weather, with almost no sleep or rest. They were taught to parachute from low-flying planes, often at night, into unfamiliar territory, with the risk of being impaled on a branch or drowning in a swamp. This was the first, crudest stage of elimination, where only the strongest and most resilient survived. Did they survive? Yes, but their bodies, like their souls, were forever scarred by this brutal experience. The next stage was mastering special skills: radio operations, topography, navigation by stars and moss, cryptography, and secret writing. All of it was hammered into their heads day and night. They had to be able to set up a radio and transmit a coded message in minutes, knowing that enemy direction finders were already on their trail. They had to be able to read a map better than a novel and memorize the location of enemy facilities at a single glance. Any mistake, any forgotten detail meant not just a bad grade, but certain death for themselves and their comrades. This sword of Damocles hung constantly over their heads, never allowing them to relax for a second. But the most terrifying and inhuman part of the training was the psychological conditioning. They were not just taught to survive behind enemy lines. They were taught to be shadows, ghosts, people without a name or a past. They were taught to lie, to pretend, to win trust. They were taught to kill silently, using a knife, a garrote, or their bare hands. And most importantly, they were prepared for what would happen in case of failure. They were told, in graphic detail, about the torture methods used by the Gestapo. They were taught how to behave during interrogations, how to buy time, how to lead the enemy on a false trail. And finally, they were taught how to take their own lives so as not to betray their comrades. The cyanide ampule sewn into a collar or the last bullet in a pistol. This was not a choice, but a duty. As these 17 and 18-year-old girls listened to these lectures, their young eyes reflected not fear, but a cold, unchildlike resolve. They knew what they were getting into. They knew they were being sent on a one-way trip. This was not just a school for spies, it was a school for shadows, a school for suicide missions, where the main subject was the science of dying with dignity. And this was a lesson Masha and Nadya learned better than anyone else. From October 1941 to January 1942, just 3 short, terrible months, Masha and Nadya lived their second, secret life. This life was woven from fear, cold, hunger, and constant, second-by-second tension. They were shadows, ghosts in the deep German rear, in the area of Maloyaroslavets, Tarutino, Medin, and Kaluga. Their mission was to see everything, hear everything, and remain invisible. Any sidelong glance, any careless word, any suspicious rustle could be their last. But these girls, who were yesterday's schoolgirls, accomplished what seemed impossible. They played their quiet, deadly game in the very heart of the wolf's lair. Could they have known that this game, full of courage and self-sacrifice, would end so tragically and so soon? Crossing the front line, they left behind not only their comrades, but also their real names and biographies. They became refugees, orphans, or nieces of non-existent aunts, heading to a distant village in search of food and shelter. They slept in abandoned barns and haystacks, ate frozen potatoes they dug up from the fields, and shared the last crust of bread they had traded for some old rag. Their clothes turned to tatters, and their bodies were infested with lice, but their eyes remained sharp and their memories keen. Their minds, like dispassionate computers, recorded everything: unit numbers, the quantity of tanks and guns, the direction of columns, and the locations of headquarters and warehouses. Did they feel like heroes in those moments? No, they felt only the icy cold, the gnawing hunger, and the animal fear they had to push into the furthest corners of their minds. Their most valuable weapon was a portable radio. At night, hidden in a dense forest or an abandoned dugout, they would set up the antenna and, with fingers trembling from cold and anxiety, tap out their priceless reports on the key. Each communication session was a gamble with death. They knew that German direction finders were already scanning the airwaves, trying to pinpoint their short, intermittent signals. After a few minutes, they had to change position immediately, cover their tracks, and dissolve back into the night. This constant chase, this feeling of being a hunted animal, exhausted them more than any physical labor. But they continued to transmit again and again, because they knew that back there, behind the front lines, every word they sent could save hundreds, even thousands, of lives. Their work bore fruit. The former head of intelligence for the 43rd Army recalled how, after receiving precise coordinates from Masha for a major German headquarters near Medin, the Soviet Air Force delivered a devastating blow. Dozens of officers, several generals, and important documents were destroyed. At Army headquarters, they were amazed by the pinpoint accuracy of the bombing. No one, except for a few people, knew that behind this success was a fragile 17-year-old girl with magnificent braids, who at that very moment, risking everything, was directing the fire while sitting in a frozen forest. Was this success their triumph? Yes, but it was a triumph for which the ultimate, terrible price would have to be paid. Life behind enemy lines was not only mortally dangerous, but also morally unbearable. They saw grief, death, and the humiliation of their people. They saw hanged partisans, burned villages, and weeping women. And they had to remain silent, clenching their teeth, not betraying themselves with a single gesture or a single tear. This constant need to wear a mask of indifference was perhaps the most severe torture. It seared their souls, leaving behind only a cold, ringing emptiness and a single thought: survive, report, and avenge. But fate was already counting down the final days of their short lives, scorched by war. January 17th, 1942. This day, lost in the bloody turmoil of that terrible winter, would be the last for Masha Sinelnikova and Nadya Pronina. The frost intensified, chilling them to the bone, and the deep snow seemed to absorb all sounds, making the world deaf and indifferent to human suffering. It was on this day, in this frozen hell, that they were to carry out their final, most crucial, and most deadly mission. They did not yet know that they were not just going on another reconnaissance mission, but to their Golgotha. Did they know that this would be their last sunrise? Perhaps their young hearts clenched with a vague, chilling premonition, but the duty, hammered into their minds by months of brutal training, was stronger than any fear. After the successful counteroffensive near Moscow in December of 41, the Red Army was driving the Germans westward. But the enemy, having recovered from the initial shock, fought back fiercely, clinging to every settlement, every hill. Near Kaluga, in the village of Korchashkino, the Germans had concentrated fresh forces, preparing for a counterattack. The command of the 43rd Army urgently needed precise intelligence: the number and composition of the group, the locations of firing positions and headquarters. The mission was crystal clear and extremely dangerous, and it was assigned to them, to Masha and Nadya. They went on the mission under false names that had already become their second skin. Masha was now Valentina, a resident of Kaluga, and Nadya was Verka, a simple village girl. Their cover story was simple and unassuming: 2 refugees fleeing the war, looking for food and shelter. On their backs, they carried not radios and weapons, but a couple of small bundles with some rags. But beneath these pathetic tatters beat the hearts of fearless warriors, and in their minds, they held information more valuable than gold. Their path lay through snow-covered fields and forests, in territory teeming with German patrols and collaborators. Every step was a risk. They walked, sinking waist-deep in snow, frostbitten and hungry, but stubbornly moved toward their goal. They had to get as close to the village as possible, count the tanks, memorize the locations of machine gun nests, and then return to report their findings. It was the routine, terrifying work of a scout, in which there was no room for glory or heroism, only cold calculation and mortal danger. By the evening of January 17th, exhausted, they reached the outskirts of Korchachkino. They needed to find shelter, to wait out the night, and begin their surveillance at dawn. A large haystack on the edge of a field seemed like the perfect hiding place. It could offer them both salvation from the piercing wind and reliable cover. Burrowing into the hay, they may have allowed themselves a few moments to relax, to get warm, to drift into an uneasy sleep. But this moment of peace proved to be fatal. The enemy was closer than they thought, and fate had already raised its merciless axe above them. Their last day was coming to an end, and ahead lay only an endless night of torture and pain. On the evening of January 17, 1942, as Masha and Nadya burrowed into the seemingly saving warmth of a haystack, trying to get warm and wait for dawn, their quiet, fragile world collapsed. They had walked into a trap. What was it? A tragic accident or someone's malicious intent? A cloud of betrayal has shrouded this story ever since, leaving behind only the bitter taste of ambiguity and the eternal, unanswered question: who? Who condemned these young girls to a martyr's death? Or was there even a who at all? Perhaps it was the war itself, with its blind, ruthless logic, that became their ultimate betrayer. According to the official and most widespread version, they were discovered by a collaborator patrol. At that time, the Germans, frightened by the activity of partisans and reconnaissance groups, conducted constant sweeps of the territory. Haystacks, forests, abandoned houses, all were combed in search of the invisible enemy. 2 unknown girls hiding in a haystack on the outskirts of the village could not fail to arouse suspicion. Perhaps one of the locals spotted them and, fearing reprisal or hoping for a reward, reported them to the authorities. In the atmosphere of universal fear and distrust that reigned in the occupied territories, this was a common occurrence. This betrayal, if it indeed happened, was Masha and Nadya's death sentence. But there is another, more complex and ambiguous version that calls into question the canonical image of the heroines. Some researchers, analyzing scattered testimonies, point to strange inconsistencies in their final mission. Why were they so far from their main objective, the village of Tarutino? Why do some eyewitness accounts mention a young man named Victor next to Masha instead of Nadya? These questions have given rise to a terrible suspicion. Could there have been an element of desertion in their story? Were they simply trying to survive, to get lost in the bloody chaos, but were captured, and only then, in captivity, displayed the courage that wrote their names into history? This cynical and cruel version has never found convincing proof, but like a poisonous thorn, it has forever tainted their posthumous glory, making future generations doubt even the sacred. But whatever the case, the fact remains. On January 17th, they were captured. For Masha and Nadya, it didn't matter at that moment who had betrayed them: a cowardly villager, a random patrol, or their own deceptive hope for salvation. When a rough shout in German erupted from the darkness and the blinding beam of a flashlight struck their faces, they understood. This was the end of their short lives and the beginning of their long, endless night of torment. During the search, they found the radio. It was the primary, irrefutable piece of evidence. They were no longer faceless refugees. In the eyes of the Germans, they were spies, saboteurs, the most dangerous of enemies who deserved neither leniency nor mercy. Under the muzzles of submachine guns, freezing from cold and fear, they were led to the village of Korchashkino, to the headquarters housed in a simple peasant hut. They walked over the crunching snow, and that sound was like the shattering glass of their youth, their hopes, their lives. The trap had snapped shut. Ahead, there was only darkness. The night of January 17th to the 18th, 1942, was moonless and silent in the village of Korchashkino. Only the crunch of snow under the boots of patrols and the occasional bark of a dog broke the dead silence. But in one of the peasant huts, converted into a German headquarters, a different kind of drama was unfolding, a spectacle of human cruelty and inhuman courage. Here, in this simple cottage, Masha and Nadya came face to face with a beast, and this beast, dressed in a field-gray uniform, tried to tear the truth from their young souls using the oldest and most terrible of all arguments, pain. Everything we know about that terrible night comes from the words of a single witness, a local resident named Natalia Pavlova, in whose house the first, most brutal interrogation took place. Hiding behind the stove, frozen with terror, she saw everything through a crack in the wall. Her fragmented, pain-filled memories are the only window into the hell that Masha and Nadya endured in their final hours. Did she feel her own helplessness, her powerlessness in the face of this nightmare? Undoubtedly. And she carried that feeling of helplessness, mixed with horror, throughout her entire life. The beast had a specific name and face. He was a tall, red-haired German officer. He was the one conducting the interrogation, and he started with Masha. Perhaps it was her defiant look, her fiery gaze, or maybe her Jewish features that provoked a special, sadistic fury in him. He beat her terribly, methodically, with expertise. He beat her with his fists, his feet, the buckle of his soldier's belt.
"I will never forget how they beat that girl with the braids," Natalia Pavlova recalled. "The German hit her with his buckle, with the heels of his boots, and she would fall, but then jump right back up." Was this just an interrogation? No, it was a ritual humiliation, an attempt to break not only her body, but her spirit. And then something happened that shocked both the torturers and the unwilling witness. Masha, this 17-year-old girl, did not cry, did not beg for mercy. After each blow, with her lips beaten to a bloody pulp, she would get back on her feet and, looking her executioner in the face, shout something at him in German. Her speech was fast, furious, full of contempt. Knowing the enemy's language, she used it as a weapon. She wasn't making excuses. She was making accusations. She threw all her hatred, all her pain for her desecrated homeland and her murdered family into the face of this beast. She turned her own torture into a tribunal against fascism. Did that officer understand that he was facing not just a captured radio operator, but the embodiment of the unbending spirit of an entire nation? And Nadya. Nadya sat in the corner, curled into a ball, and cried quietly. These were not tears of fear or weakness. They were tears of compassion for her friend, tears of helplessness, tears of a rage she could not unleash. Her quiet weeping and Masha's furious shouts merged in that hut into a single, terrible, heart-wrenching requiem for their ruined youth. They were so different, even in this final, mortal hour. One a fiery fighter, the other a silent martyr. But their silence on what mattered, the codes, the contacts, the comrades, was united and unbreakable. The interrogation continued all night. Later, after the war, arrested collaborators who were present confirmed Masha's heroic behavior. According to eyewitnesses, the terrible screams of the tortured girls could be heard until dawn. They had been through all the circles of hell. Their bodies were turned into one solid, bleeding bruise, but their will remained unbroken. They said nothing. They had won their final, most terrible battle, and at dawn, barely alive, they were led out to be executed. In the face of absolute evil, when the body betrays you, screaming in pain, and the mind is clouded with horror, a person has only one final line of defense: their spirit. And in that terrifying, blood-soaked hut in the village of Korchachkino, two fragile girls, Masha and Nadya, built such an unbreakable fortress of spirit that it could not be stormed by booted kicks, torture with a buckle, or death itself. Their behavior in the final hours of their lives was not just an example of heroism. It was a testament to the highest degree of human dignity, a philosophical manifesto of defiance thrown in the face of a soulless machine of destruction. What made them, standing on the threshold of non-existence, think not of themselves, but of those who would live on? The testimony of the sole witness to the torture, Natalia Pavlova, has preserved for us not only the picture of the atrocities, but also something that seems utterly incredible: the words spoken by Masha in the breaks between the abuse. When the Germans left her alone for a moment, she, barely alive, turned not to her friend, not to God, but to the witness herself, to this simple Russian woman cowering in fear behind the stove. And what she said was not a plea for help or a farewell. It was an order, a last will and testament. "Don't cry, ma'am, and don't watch how they will kill us," she whispered with broken lips. "Get out of here. You shouldn't watch. You must help us fight. Beat them, the bastards, with whatever you can." Think about these words. A person whose body has been turned into a single wound is not thinking about her own pain, but about continuing the struggle. She does not pity herself. She calls for action, for vengeance. In that moment, she was not a victim, but a warrior, a commander giving her last order. This phrase is the quintessence of that very Russian character that neither Hitler's generals nor their celebrated ideologues could ever understand or calculate. But then she says something that goes beyond mere patriotism and becomes the highest act of spiritual self-sacrifice. Realizing that her death is inevitable, that she is about to be led out for execution, she says a sentence to Natalia Pavlova that should be carved on every monument dedicated to the unknown soldier. "This death of mine, it is my life's achievement. I am dying for my motherland, and I regret nothing." Achievement. Think about that word. For her, a 17-year-old girl who had been robbed of everything, youth, love, a future, her own torturous death becomes her main and only achievement. She does not see it as a tragedy. She sees it as the fulfillment of a higher duty, the meaning of her short, abruptly ended existence. This is no longer just the psychology of a soldier. This is the psychology of a saint, a martyr who voluntarily ascends to her Golgotha, understanding that her sacrifice is not in vain, that it will become part of something greater, part of the great victory. Military psychologists, analyzing similar cases, speak of the phenomenon of terminal consciousness, where, in the face of imminent death, a person is freed from all selfish instincts and completely identifies with the idea for which they lived and are about to die. But in the case of Masha and Nadya, it was something more. It was not the exaltation of fanatics, but a calm, conscious acceptance of their fate. Raised in an atheistic state, they demonstrated the very Christian readiness for self-sacrifice that for centuries had been the foundation of the Russian spirit. Their death became their greatest achievement, their ultimate testimony of defiance. And that testimony, passed down to us by a simple village woman, proved to be more powerful than any interrogation records or any posthumous awards. The dawn of January 18th, 1942, in the village of Korchachkino, was gray and joyless, like all the dawns of that terrible winter.
It brought with it neither warmth nor hope, only a cold, indifferent light that flooded the snow-covered fields and exposed the full horror of what had happened during the night. For Masha and Nadya, this dawn was their last. Tortured and barely alive, they were led out of the hut where they had spent their final night and taken to the edge of the village, to a pre-dug pit. What did they feel in those last moments? Perhaps their souls, already cleansed by suffering, were free from fear and filled only with a quiet, bright sorrow of farewell. They were led across the crunching snow, past houses blackened by fire, past the silent, frightened faces of the local residents who had been rounded up to watch the execution. This public display was part of the ritual of intimidation, a part of the diabolical pedagogy that the Nazis so favored. They didn't just want to kill two spies. They wanted to kill the very idea of resistance, to paralyze the people's will with fear. But they had miscalculated. Looking at these two girls walking to their deaths, the people felt not fear, but a burning shame for their own powerlessness and a deep, seething hatred in their hearts. Masha and Nadya walked, supporting each other. Their bodies were broken, but not their spirits. In their walk, in the way they held their disfigured heads, there was not a shadow of submission. They walked not like criminals to their execution, but like victors in their final parade. They knew they had not said a single word to the enemy, that their comrades were safe, and that their sacrifice was not in vain. And this knowledge gave them strength. They were led to the pit at the edge of the village, near the haystack where they had been captured the day before. The circle was now complete. This place became both the beginning and the end of their final mission. According to some accounts, another person was led to the pit with them, an unknown Soviet soldier, also captured. They were placed at the edge. Shots rang out, and 3 young lives, full of unfulfilled hopes, were cut short, falling onto the frozen Kaluga soil. They were killed, but they were not defeated. Their final dawn became the beginning of their immortality. And the most striking, most ironic part of this story is that just the next day, on January 19th, Soviet troops entered Korchashkino. They were only a few hours too late. If they had arrived a little earlier, Masha and Nadya might have survived. But history has no what-ifs. Their fate had been sealed, and this proximity of salvation, this missed opportunity, makes their tragedy even more poignant and bitter. They missed liberation by a single day, one infinitely long and infinitely short day. The war rolled westward, leaving behind the ashes of villages and nameless graves. And in one such mass grave on the outskirts of the village of Korchashkino, covered with frozen earth, lay the bodies of Masha and Nadya. Only after the village was liberated were their remains found and identified. An investigation began. Testimonies were collected, and surviving locals were interviewed. And from these fragmented stories, full of pain and fear, a terrible yet majestic picture of their heroism gradually emerged, like piecing together a shattered mirror. What became of their legacy, this testament written in their own blood on the frozen Kaluga soil? Did it become a formidable accusation or a quiet reminder that time has almost erased from memory? Their story, initially just one of thousands like it, came to public attention. Newspapers wrote about them, and their names became a symbol of the courage and resilience of Soviet women in the war. Later, they were reburied with full military honors in a mass grave in the village of Polotniany Zavod, not far from Korchashkino. Their names, which had become sacred to the local residents, were carved on a modest obelisk. Students from the Moscow Institute of Foreign Languages, where Masha had studied before the war, became patrons of the grave, turning it into a place of pilgrimage, a living relay of memory. Maria Sinelnikova was posthumously awarded the Order of the Patriotic War, First Class, and Nadezhda Pronina received the Order of the Red Banner. These were high honors, earned at the cost of unimaginable suffering and life itself. But their main legacy lies not in medals or newspaper articles. It is in the moral lesson they taught both their contemporaries and us, their descendants. These two young girls, when faced with absolute evil, did not break, did not submit, did not fall into despair. They chose the path of resistance, the path of active, fierce struggle to their very last breath. Their story is a terrible reminder that war does not have a woman's face. It mercilessly ground up everyone, men, women, the elderly, and children. But at the same time, this terrible, inhuman war also brought out the very best in people, the highest qualities that make us human, the capacity for self-sacrifice, loyalty to duty, and an unbending strength of spirit. Today, as the Great Patriotic War becomes an increasingly distant, abstract story from textbooks for new generations, tales like that of Masha and Nadya acquire a special value. They restore the war to its true human dimension. They make us feel not only pride for the great victory, but also a piercing, sharp pain for every one of the millions of lives cut short. The legacy of Masha and Nadya is not just a heroic myth. It is our genetic memory, a part of our national code. And to forget it is to betray not only them, but ourselves. Time is a great healer and a ruthless executioner. It erases faces, names, and events from memory, leaving only dry figures in archival reports. The story of Masha Sinelnikova and Nadya Pronina's heroism seemed destined for oblivion, like thousands of other similar stories. But memory has its own laws, which are not subject to time. And the echo of their last cry, their dying whisper, continues to resound today, breaking through the thickness of decades, forcing us to look again and again into the past to discern our own future in it. What makes their story so alive, so poignant, so necessary for us today? The paradox of their posthumous fate is that it turned out to be as much of a battlefield as their short lives. In the 70s, when their names were already carved on obelisks and their feat had become a textbook example, a scandal erupted. It was suddenly revealed that the heroic spy Maria Sinelnikova was, in fact, Mira Vulfovna Sinelnikova, a Jewish woman. And this fact, in an atmosphere of state-sponsored anti-Semitism, became the basis for terrible insinuations by some. A general involved in memorializing them suddenly put forward a monstrous theory. What if she was a traitor? What if she was now working for Radio Liberty or Israeli intelligence? Her name was erased from the monument in Polotnyany Zavod. It was only through the efforts of relatives and honest journalists who achieved justice through the courts that her name was restored. This ugly episode is the best evidence that the war for memory, for truth, never ends. Today, in an era of information wars and total revisionism, when there are attempts to belittle, distort, and drown the heroism of the Soviet people in a flood of lies, the story of Masha and Nadya takes on a special, poignant relevance. Like a tuning fork, it sets our historical memory to the right pitch. It reminds us of the terrible price that was paid for victory. It does not let us forget that behind the dry statistics of losses stand millions of individual, living, young destinies just like theirs. Their heroism is not the grand, poster-style kind. It is a quiet, everyday, almost invisible heroism, performed not for glory or awards, but for life itself. They did not throw themselves under tanks with grenades or hoist the flag over the Reichstag. They simply did their terrible, thankless job, risking everything every single day. And it is in this quiet, daily courage, in this ability to maintain human dignity in the face of inhuman trials, that their main legacy lies. The echo of their story resounds even today, in school museums, in street names, and in the hearts of those who keep their memory alive. And as long as this echo sounds, as long as we remember the names of these two girls who stepped so terribly and so majestically into immortality, we will remain a people worthy of their great sacrifice. The power of their memory is our strength, a strength that helps us not to lose our way and to remember that there are things more important than momentary gain and comfort. There is duty, there is honor, there is the motherland, and there is a memory written in blood. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, subscribe, and don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss our new videos. There are more amazing stories to come. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones.